And let's start with looking at external goals in characters. And firstly, this is off record, but wouldn't you just say that when we're looking at these things, how important is psychology in screenwriting?
Yeah.
It's just crazy, isn't it?
Especially when we get into the internal stuff, which is absolutely is psychology. But yeah, kicking off with this one, I mean, for a lot of our viewers, I'm sure some of this stuff will be kind of refresher and just kind of clarity on stuff they kind of already know. So the external goals are your character's conscious desires, is what I would describe it as. It's the thing, if you ask them, that they know they want and they're trying to achieve it. And it's really critical for providing story momentum. It's the thing that drives your story, because your character is actively, consciously seeking that goal. And it can be anything. It's often very tangible. External goals tend to be very tangible. They're often power, wealth, love. They're things that kind of we can all relate to. But in other genres, they might be something like solving a mystery or staying alive in a thriller. So they're really clearly defined, they're very obvious, and your character should be really striving towards it. And they give you this fantastic framework. And they really kind of give you all those plot beats. You know, they're the thing that you can throw obstacles in front of. So it gives you a sense of forward momentum, and allows you to create a really clear structure for your story, particularly in films.
Fantastic. And so you kind of covered this a little bit already in your answer, but how important are these external goals for driving the plot? And sort of alongside that, I guess, how important are the obstacles that to come against that kind of external goal?
I think I mean, for me, all of these things that we're talking about tonight, and whenever we talk about screenwriting craft and the tools that you can use, essentially all you're trying to do, however you do it, is make your reader or viewer want to know what happens next. That's essentially, for me, your only job as a screenwriter is to make me stay. That's it.
So true.
I think we talked about this a little bit before, and there are so many different ways you can do it. And it's just having a toolkit of things at your disposal. And it depends, again, for films especially, this will depend how heavily the external goal and those obstacles drive the plot, and how focused the storytelling is on that often depends as well on how commercial the work is and how commercial you want it to be. So a very mainstream, Hollywood blockbuster is going to have really clearly defined goals. Something more art house will have slightly more subtly defined goals that might be harder to describe even after you've watched the film. So I think the kind of where it sits on the commercial spectrum also influences this. But even with those kind of slightly more art house end of the spectrum films, I still think that those external goals give you a framework. How deep you bury them within the scenes and how loosely you use that framework is kind of up to you, but I think still having it gives you a shape that you can work to.
Brilliant.
So I think they do, which goes on to your question about plot, is a really interesting one, because I think external goals are directly related to plot. It is the thing they're striving for. It's the thing they're trying to achieve. It's the obstacles you put in the way of them achieving that. That's what keeps us watching, because they're trying to get to this thing or achieve this thing, and then you make it hard for them, and they have to pick themselves up and dust themselves down and try again. And that's what makes us root for them, is that struggle. So yeah, I think this goes, I'm probably going to jump ahead a little bit or something.
Don't worry.
This also depends on genre a lot, like how heavily plot driven your film is, will depend on how high in the mix the external goals are compared to the internal. So, for example, in a very commercial piece of work, in a genre like thriller or action, those external goals are really clear and very central to the way the whole thing works. In other genres, I think they're more buried and more loosely constructed. We'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about internal goals, I suspect.
I have this, like, I know it's going slightly off piece, but just jumping off the back of that, I have a question that in this kind of world where we're seeing a lot of blending, subversion of genres, is it, if sort of aside from genre, how important is it that like all characters within a film or a series have an external goal? Is that important? Does it, even the minor characters, would you say?
Yeah, and I think this is where you kind of, it's how you differentiate projects when you're evaluating for something like a script competition. It's the difference between the ones that make it to the semi-final and the ones that make it to the final. It's that next level of writing and attention to detail. When you read a script where every character, no matter how minor, if they're named, they're really clearly defined, and they've got some kind of internal story and some kind of external story. Even if it's only 3 scenes across the whole film, it's that level of detail and layering that makes the very best scripts really stand out.
Great.
So I think absolutely, if you want to get to that next level with your writing, it is paying that amount of attention to every character, no matter how secondary they are. But we might talk about that again a little bit more when we talk about internal goals, because that's around character definition, really, because you can't do internal goals unless you've really defined your character.
Totally. And that's so, I guess that brings us quite sort of naturally on to the next question, which is what's the difference in the playing out of these external goals? In, for example, a feature film, and we are slightly more focusing on feature film tonight, but how would that be different in a series arc? And does that again depend on if it's a genre specific film or series?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So external goals are really important in both. The example I was thinking about actually when I was pondering this earlier was Breaking Bad's a really good example of this. Yeah. Because you can really clearly give a quest story, essentially, in a feature film and pay it off at the end. They achieved what they wanted or didn't, which we can talk about more. And in something like a thriller, that kind of is so neat and so satisfying. And the challenge with something like that, a very, very external goal-driven, plot-driven genre like thrillers, is it's very hard to sustain that over 10 hours. Yeah. Because is it plausible that you're still on the run? You know what I mean? You know, if you imagine trying to sustain a Bourne story over 10 hours times 4 seasons, you start to go, really?
Exhausting for everyone.
Yeah, and you start to stretch the credibility of it once you extend the length of it, which is why those genres are very hard to do in television. And that's where I think one of the interesting techniques you can use, and Breaking Bad is such a good example of this, I think, for both internal and external, is that actually his external goals are different in every series. So the external goal you start his story with, Walter White's story at the beginning of Breaking Bad, is not the same external goal he has, the conscious desire he has when you start season 6. He doesn't want the same things. He's not still trying to achieve the thing he set out to try and achieve at the beginning of series 1. So what you can do in a series is to shift that conscious desire. He either achieves it or he doesn't, but something happens internally that means he actually wants something different the next series.
Fantastic.
So, and I'm sure I'm not giving away any spoilers, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, no.
Start series 1 wanting to be a drug lord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're not trying to tell that story over 20, 30, 40 hours of drama. He's just trying to get enough money to pay his medical bills, and he's trying to keep it secret. So he's got a couple of really clear goals that sustain that first series. And then those external goals and what he consciously wants shift for the start of the next series, and that's what helps to give you incredible momentum.
And it's also so much more authentic in general, isn't it? Because if you're staying with especially if you're staying with a story, you know, for more than an hour and a half. Just a quick question, really, again, naturally flowing on from this. Do external goals, you've already answered that they can shift, but if we're looking at feature film, do external goals need to stay the same in a feature script? I know there's no real rules to anything, but also do they need to be achieved in a feature script, or can they change?
Yeah, I think both. I think both can be true. Absolutely, they can shift, and but it has to be as a consequence of something changing for the character, internal. I think it could be an internal change in them that makes them want something different that they wanted at the start. And I think they absolutely cannot be achieved. My favorite example, and I'm gonna apologies, you've heard me talk on webinars and sessions before, but my absolute favorite example of a really clear difference between external and internal goals is The Wizard of Oz. Brilliant. So I talk about it because she sings about both. It's and it's a film that so many people know, such a big percentage of any kind of viewing audience will know that film, or know it enough to be able to kind of reference it. She sets out at the beginning with a really clearly defined external goal, which, as everybody knows, is to go somewhere over the rainbow, right? It's the forerunner of the Disney Wish song. She sings, she wants to be somewhere over the rainbow. And the reason she wants to be somewhere else other than on a farm in Kansas is because of her internal goal and her flaw. She's not a happy, contented bunny on a farm in Kansas. She's very dissatisfied, right? So the two things are really, really tied together. Her external goal is a symptom of her character flaw, which is she's very dissatisfied with her life. She's not contented. She thinks the answers and happiness lie somewhere else. And she doesn't get what she wanted, in the sense that she ends up back where she started. Yes, she goes on an adventure, but she doesn't get to stay there. In fact, she chooses not to stay there. She clicks her heels at the end of the film because she's learned her lesson. She's learned that there is no place like home.
That's beautiful, actually. It's so
simple.
It's so simple. Yeah, it's so simple.
So powerful. She goes through such a big transformation in terms of how she feels about her family and where she is, and her friends, and her life in Kansas. And yet it's the external goal that drives the plot, that makes her seek adventure somewhere else. But she seeks it because she's dissatisfied. And actually the satisfaction doesn't come from that life in Technicolor over the rainbow. It comes from her family around her bedside.
It's actually such an incredibly deep film, isn't it? The more we analyze it, it's like, but that's such a great example, because I think it's a great example. It's a very clear example. I think most of us will have watched that film, so we can all clearly understand.
And also I think what it does for us is just also you can see how even within such a clearly defined framework for both an external goal that's driving the plot and pushing her forwards, and an internal change, both really clearly defined to the extent that they're verbalized, you can still do whatever you want.
Yeah,
You just think about that story, the world, and the
scarecrow.
characters, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you've got absolute, so even within this really tightly constructed, really clearly defined set of external and internal goals, the thing that most excites me is that kind of you've got absolute freedom.
Yeah.
Creatively. And I think sometimes writers are kind of slightly nervous about, clearly defined goals and plot and tight structure, and because they feel like it's kind of inhibiting their creativity. And they want to be freer than that. And that's why I think The Wizard of Oz is such a great example of the amount of creative freedom you have, even in probably the most clearly defined external and internal goals example I think there is on screen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's so helpful. And before we move on to internal goals, could we talk a little bit more about I'm going to ask you any tools or tips for writers in how they can, once they know their main characters or characters' conscious goals, how can they play with conflict to kind of how can they play with obstacles to kind of create that conflict, to keep it interesting, to keep it staying?
Because you don't just want them kind of working through a series of really obvious obstacles that you kind of could have mapped out at the beginning, kind of as a viewer. You need surprises along the way, and that is, I think, one of the things that again marks out kind of that next level feature film scripts is the amount of different sources of conflict that the writer draws upon. So we put an article up a couple of months ago up on Script Angel about this, about kind of creating conflict and all the different tools that again are available to you that you can draw on as a writer. And obviously one of the big conflicts that is happening that makes it difficult, that allows you to make it difficult for your character to achieve their goal, is their own internal flaw, which we'll come on to. So conflict with self, but also obviously it's conflict with others. And an antagonist is the obvious one. And obviously, again, that antagonistic force that is a challenge to your main character, that does provide a lot of the obstacles, is really obvious and prominent in some genres. Thriller, again, being the obvious. Horror often as well. There's a really clear antagonist who is in direct opposition to your lead character's wants. And obviously knowing why they're in opposition and why they want something different and why what they want puts them at odds with your protagonist is really important. But even kind of at that kind of supporting cast of characters level, even your character's friends and allies can be an obstacle. I think Moxie is a great example of that, where those character relationships, even with friends, provide lots of conflict and goals. And again, that's because those other characters are so well defined and have their own wants and conscious desires. And when those two things clash, you make it hard for your character to get what they want. So you put other characters in their way. But you can also have them at odds with their environment. I think kind of characters ill at ease in their social environment, in a political environment, in a cultural environment, in a physical environment. Obviously, if you're doing adventure and action, the physical environment is often, a source of conflict and obstacle. So I think there are so many aspects of your story world and your characters, surrounding characters, that provide those obstacles. It's not just, the kind of the obvious one of an antagonist who is trying to stop them. But even then, I think just thinking of other examples, particularly in drama, where external goals aren't as prominent all of the time. I was thinking of a great drama film like 3 Billboards.
Oh, I love that film.
Right, and even there, I mean, it's a drama. It's really. It's not a thriller. She's not trying to save the world. There's no great kind of mystery, that's not what drives it, but she has a really clearly defined goal. There is something she wants, you know, and again, I think if you're, whatever genre you're working in, I think looking at other examples in a similar space, tonally, commercially, and genre wise, you can see what other tips, what tricks other writers have used to create conflict and create obstacles and create that momentum. Because essentially, you're just trying to make it really hard for your character to get what they want.
Yeah. Fantastic. That was amazing. I'm going to be listening back on this again.